Welcome back, everybody. This time, we're tackling something pretty epic. The genealogy and lifespans laid out in Genesis 5. Specifically, we're focusing on that line from Adam to Noah.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. I mean, talk about a family tree with some serious history.
It's really fascinating because in ancient societies, genealogies weren't just like, oh, here's my family tree. They were like powerful statements.
Right, like your ID card almost.
Yeah, identity, legitimacy, even authority.
Yeah.
So imagine a world where your lineage could directly connect you back to the very first human.
Whoa, that's heavy. It really puts those names into perspective, right? Like when Genesis says Adam was created in the likeness of God and mentions he had sons and daughters, it's easy to skim over that and daughters part, but
Right.
it suggests a bigger picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It sets the stage for a much broader narrative. Even though we're honing in on this one specific line,
Yeah.
it hints at a world teeming with life and complexity, much like our own, right?
For sure. Okay, so let's get to Adam's son, Seth.
Yeah.
Now get this. Seth lived to be 912 years old. That's mind-boggling, right?
Yeah.
Especially compared to our lifespans today. Makes you wonder, were these lifespans meant to be taken literally?
Well, it's a question that's puzzled scholars for centuries, really. Some interpretations do lean towards that literal understanding. They suggest there might have been environmental or genetic factors, things that could have contributed to that longevity back then.
So like a different world almost.
Imagine a world where the environment or even human biology itself was so different that it actually allowed for those extended lifespans.
It's an intriguing idea, for sure. But wouldn't a literal interpretation, wouldn't it clash with what we know about human biology today?
You bring up a valid point, and that's why many scholars propose that these numbers might be symbolic rather than literal.
Okay, I can see that. So it's not about the actual years, but more about what those years represent.
Precisely. Think of it like this. It's about understanding the text within its cultural and literary context. These numbers might not represent actual years lived, but rather the perceived closeness of these early generations to God or to the time of creation.
Ah, so their age reflects their spiritual significance, or maybe their authority, rather than their actual time on Earth.
Exactly. It's a way of emphasizing their stature and importance in the whole story. For example, Seth's son, Enoch, he lived for 905 years. And then Enoch's son, Kenan, he made it to 910. The consistency of these extremely long lifespans, it's striking.
It really is. It's like the text is trying to transport us to this time vastly different from our own, right? We're peering into this mythical realm where people live for centuries.
And that sense of otherworldliness, it gets even more emphasized with figures like Mahalalel, Kenan's son. He only lived, quote-unquote, a brief 895 years.
Haha, right? Only.
Even with these slight variations, the sheer length of their lives sets them apart.
True, true. Okay, but then we get to Jared, son of Mahalalel, who lived for a whopping 962 years. He practically reached a millennium. Why such a standout, even within this pattern of super long lives?
Now, this is where comparing these accounts to other ancient mythologies gets really interesting.
Ooh, okay, like what?
Well, think about the ancient Mesopotamians, for example. They have all these stories of primeval ancestors or heroes with incredibly long reigns, too. It seems like a lot of cultures were fascinated with this idea of longevity, our place in the grand scheme of time.
Right, so Jared's age could be a deliberate echo of these older myths, like another layer of meaning in the story.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that these texts weren't created in a vacuum. They were part of a larger cultural and literary world, borrowing from and reinterpreting existing themes and motifs. And now this brings us to a really intriguing figure, Enoch, Jared's son. He only lived for 365 years, a huge difference from those who came before. Plus, the text specifically says God took him away.
That's right. Was Enoch's shorter life connected to that, or is it just to highlight his, unique fate?
It's hard to say for sure. But the fact that he departs so abruptly, coupled with his relatively short life, definitely sets him apart. Makes you wonder, what's the deeper meaning there? Perhaps it's emphasizing his special bond with God.
That's a good point. Okay, then we have Methuselah, Enoch's son. And let's be honest, his name is practically synonymous with long life, 969 years, the oldest in this whole genealogy.
I mean, Methuselah's age has become almost legendary, right? Even in modern language. It speaks to the enduring power of these stories, how they capture the imagination across time.
It makes you wonder what he must have seen and experienced in all those years. Then we have Lamech, Methuselah's son, who lived for 777 years. Still a crazy long time, but kind of on the shorter end compared to his ancestors.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Lamech is like a bridge between these figures with incredibly long lives and the world we see with Noah and the flood that comes later. He's a transitional figure leading us towards a new era.
Yeah, I see that. And speaking of Noah, the text mentions he was 500 years old when he became a father. That detail definitely sets the stage for the flood, but it also seems young compared to everyone else.
You're right, Noah's age at fatherhood, while still extraordinary by our standards, does mark a kind of shift. It's like a transition to a new era, one where the lifespans start to resemble something closer to what we know today.
It's like the story is slowly moving away from that mythical realm of the almost immortal.
Wow.
But before we go further, I think it's worth reflecting on what we've learned so far. I mean, these lifespans, they defy our understanding, right? We've glimpsed a world vastly different from our own. What are your thoughts on these incredible ages and what they tell us about how the authors of Genesis viewed the world?
That's a fantastic question. And it leads us to some even deeper insights about this whole genealogy and its meaning, really.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, but for me, it's what those numbers represent that's really mind-blowing. We're talking lifetimes, filled with experiences, relationships, joy, sorrow. But on a scale we can barely even imagine.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? These weren't just names on a list. They were individuals who lived, loved, and shaped the world around them for centuries. Imagine the wisdom and knowledge accumulated over those vast stretches of time. It challenges our very notion of what a human life can be,
It really does. And remember how each entry mentioned them having other sons and daughters besides the named heir. It creates this picture of a bustling, vibrant world, not just a straight line from one generation to the next.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a crucial detail. It reminds us that even though the text is focusing on this one specific lineage, there was a much larger human story happening all around them. These individuals were part of a complex society, a world teeming with life, interactions, stories that we can only guess at.
Okay, so we've walked through these incredible lifespans, but what does it all mean for us today? Like, are we supposed to take these ages literally?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. As we touched on earlier, some interpretations do argue for that literal understanding. They suggest there could have been environmental or genetic factors at play, things that could have contributed to such long lifespans back then.
So you're saying maybe the world was just different back then, like the air was purer, the food was more nourishing, or even, I don't know, maybe there were genetic factors that we haven't even discovered yet that played a role.
Exactly. Some scholars propose that the early chapters of Genesis are describing a world fundamentally different from our own world. Maybe even a primordial era, where the laws of nature, as we understand them, operated differently. But of course, this interpretation requires us to consider possibilities that might lie outside our current scientific framework.
I see. So it's fascinating, but maybe not the most scientifically sound approach.
Right. And that's why many other interpretations focus on the symbolic meaning embedded within these numbers. Remember our discussion about the cultural significance of genealogies? Well, in ancient societies, they weren't just about recording family lineage. They were about establishing authority, legitimacy.
So maybe those extreme ages aren't meant to be taken as literal years lived, but more as a way to convey the importance and status of these figures. Kind of like saying, this person lived a long and prosperous life, even if it wasn't literally for 900 years.
Precisely. The numbers become a literary device, a way of emphasizing the stature and significance of these individuals within the narrative. Their age becomes a symbol of their closeness to creation, their wisdom, their authority within their communities.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when we say someone is as old as the hills, right? We're not saying they've literally been around for centuries, but we are emphasizing their age and experience.
A perfect analogy. It helps us understand how ancient audiences might have interpreted these numbers, not as literal facts, but as symbolic representations of something much greater.
So it's not necessarily about historical accuracy, but about conveying a deeper meaning within the story. That's a really interesting way to look at it. It feels like we're peeling back layers of meaning here, moving beyond just the surface level of the text.
You're exactly right. And that's the beauty of these deep dives, isn't it? We're not just uncovering information. We're engaging with ideas that have resonated for millennia, exploring their power and their enduring relevance to our understanding of ourselves and the world we live in.
I'm starting to see how these stories can be interpreted on multiple levels. It's like each lifespan is a puzzle piece, and we're trying to fit them all together to create this bigger picture.
Precisely. We start to see how these ancient texts weren't created in isolation. They were part of a much larger conversation, drawing on and reinterpreting existing traditions to craft new and meaningful narratives.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize we can't just read these stories at face value, right? We have to
Yeah.
consider the cultural and literary influences that shape them. It's like trying to understand a piece of music without knowing anything about the composer or the historical period in which it was written.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the richness and complexity they offer and understanding that multiple interpretations can coexist and enrich our understanding of the text. Now, thinking back to the genealogy itself, we see this interplay between literal and symbolic meanings in the Fezer of Lamech. His lifespan of 777 years, while still incredibly long by our standards, is noticeably shorter than his predecessors. And as we mentioned before, he's the father of Noah, a key figure in the upcoming flood narrative.
Right. His lifespan seems to bridge that gap between the almost mythical ages of the earlier patriarchs and the more human-scale lifespan of Noah.
Exactly. It's as if the narrative is gradually moving away from this realm of the almost immortal to a world that, while still extraordinary, feels a bit closer to our own experience.
So Lamech acts as a transitional figure, guiding us from that time of the incredibly long-lived patriarchs to the more familiar world of Noah and the flood.
Precisely. It's a subtle shift in the narrative, but an important one. It suggests a change in the order of things, a transition to a new era where human lifespans become more aligned with what we experience today.
This makes me think about the flood narrative itself. It's often seen as a story of destruction and renewal, right? A kind of reset button for humanity. Could this shift in lifespans be connected to that theme?
That's a very insightful observation. The flood is indeed a pivotal event in the biblical narrative. It marks a turning point in human history, separating the pre-flood world from the world that follows. And the gradual decrease in lifespans we see in this genealogy could definitely be interpreted as foreshadowing that transition.
So the flood isn't just a physical event, but also a symbolic one, representing a change in the human experience, our relationship with the divine.
Exactly. It signifies a new beginning for humanity, a departure from the mythical past and a move toward a more recognizable, albeit still extraordinary world.
Wow, it's amazing how much depth there is to these seemingly simple genealogical entries. We've gone from talking about these incredible lifespans to exploring the very nature of time, symbolism, and even the relationship between humanity and the divine.
That's the power of deep diving into these ancient texts. They offer these endless layers of meaning and invite us to engage with profound questions about our origins, our place in the world, and the very nature of existence itself.
It's truly mind-blowing. But before we get too carried away with these big ideas, let's bring it back to the genealogy itself. We're nearing the end of our journey here, with Noah and the flood on the horizon. What key insights should we keep in mind as we move into this new era in the narrative?
That's a great question, and it leads us to some important considerations about the role of Noah and the significance of the flood in shaping the world as we know it.
You know, it's incredible. We've basically traveled back to the dawn of humanity, glimpsed a world so different from our own, yet with these echoes of family, legacy, the search for meaning, things we still grapple with today.
That's the beauty of these stories, isn't it? They tap into those universal human questions that transcend time and culture. Where we come from, what's our purpose, what's our relationship with the divine? Big stuff.
And it's amazing how just a few verses from this ancient text can spark such profound reflection. It makes you wonder about the stories we tell today and how they'll be interpreted generations from now, you know?
That's an interesting thought. It really highlights the dynamic nature of storytelling, how it shapes our understanding of the world, and how those stories from the past continue to evolve as we re-examine them, bringing our own experiences to the table.
We've gone on quite a journey here, traveled through generations, pondered lifespans that are just mind-boggling, and caught a glimpse of a world vastly different from our own. It's been quite a deep dive.
It really has. And honestly, I think we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to unearth in these ancient texts, and each reading brings new insights and perspectives. It's a journey without a real end, you know?
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, though, I'm curious, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this exploration?
That's a good question. I hope they leave with a sense of wonder, a spark of curiosity. These ancient stories, they invite us to question our assumptions, to embrace the unknown, and to really appreciate the power of narrative in shaping how we understand ourselves and the world around us. It's about opening those mental doors, you know?
Well said. And here's a final thought for everyone to ponder. If we step back from those literal interpretations, what might these extreme ages truly represent? Are they telling us more about the storyteller's worldview than about actual history? Something to think about as you continue your own journeys of discovery and understanding.
That's a fantastic question to leave our listeners with. It encourages them to think critically and creatively about these stories we inherit and the role they play in shaping how we see the past, the present, even the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into Genesis. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep your minds open to the endless wonders out there.